I'm Zach Smith, Reminiscing Rocketeer. This is my first video ever, so please be kind. This is also going to be my first video in my What If series, which is going to explore a single mission or event or almost mission having to do with something to do with space. Briefly touch on what actually happened and then look at what easily could have happened. There were accidents or potential accidents or things, things that zigged instead of zagged. How different would our history have been? So I thought it appropriate that we first tackle Apollo 10. It's the 50th anniversary this week, and Apollo 10 is filled with all kinds of interesting little tidbits and almost that you can't help but wonder, what if? Things could have gone very, very, very differently for this mission in a whole bunch of different ways. Tom Stafford, Gene Cernan, John Young took off in their Apollo Saturn V rocket in May 18th, 1969 for lunar orbit. Their mission was a full dress rehearsal of a lunar landing. So they were going to do everything up to actually landing, but everything else. Critical things that they were going to test was how did the lunar module behave in lunar gravity. Lunar gravity is not uniform. What they were after was critical radar data so that they could make the radar and guidance system more accurate. The Apollo stack looks like this. You have the command module with the service module and then the lunar module. And the lunar module is really actually two pieces. It's the descent stage and the ascent stage. The descent stage is the thing with the legs and this gold colored, and then the ascent stage is the white part. And actually when it lands, basically the descent stage becomes actually just a launch platform, and then the ascent stage takes off from that and then redocks with the command module and they fly back to Earth. They got to lunar orbit. They tested the lunar module, flew it around. I think came as close as about 9 miles or so from the lunar surface, redocked, and came home. The lunar module, interestingly enough, was named Snoopy, and the command module was named Charlie Brown, after the Peanuts characters. Snoopy had become kind of a NASA safety mascot, and so they kind of named it in honor of them, which was officially unofficial or officially official or unofficially official. It's a little weird. Anyway, they came home, and the rest was history. Their radar data was valuable, and the other things they learned they shared with Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, and the rest was history. A couple months later, in July of 1969, Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and in no small way thanks to the Apollo 10 mission and Cernan and Stafford flying around in Snoopy in lunar orbit. However, two interesting ways that this could have gone very differently. The first is while in lunar orbit, when the ascent stage separated from the descent stage, I believe it was Cernan hadn't noticed that the navigation computer had already been programmed, so he reprogrammed it, which had the effect of resetting the computer. This caused the LEM to start tumbling over and was only a few rotations away from something called gimbal lock. And gimbal lock is essentially where the navigation computer will get so confused and locked up that you won't be able to find your way back. It's a really bad situation. So, if you've ever seen the movie Apollo 13 and they're screaming, gimbal lock, it's just know that it's bad. It's not good. When Cernan got back to Earth, they had actually calculated that they were probably only about 2 seconds away from that happening. So 2 seconds from crashing into the moon. Yeah, so that would have been a bad day. Other interesting thing actually has to do with Apollo 13. The oxygen tank that exploded in Apollo 13 from the service module came out of the Apollo 10 service module. They were going to make some modifications and do some stuff to the Apollo 10 service module. So they opened it up, and the oxygen tank sits on a shelf, and they forgot to take out a screw. So when they moved that, it knocked the tank over, and they had a bunch of spares just lying around. So they just threw a different one in there and called it good. But they clearly felt comfortable enough with taking that tank later and throwing it into the Apollo 13 CSM. Guy could have simply just as easily decided to throw it back into the Apollo 10. So we're going to take a look at those two possible events. Either them not regaining control of Snoopy in time and crashing into the lunar surface, or an Apollo 13 style accident where they put the oxygen tank back in and it explodes. We're going to take those two scenarios, and we're going to break those into two buckets. Bucket one, death, either because Cernan and Stafford crashed into the moon, or because the oxygen tank exploded at any other point during the mission. The major thing about why the Apollo 13 astronauts were able to get home alive was because of when the tank blew up. If it had blown up almost at any point like later than that, there's a particularly like after the LEM had separated from the command module, they're dead. If it had exploded after, on their way home, where they no longer had the lunar module as a lifeboat, they're dead. So anything short of an exact Apollo 13 style accident, you would probably, unless it was that, you'd likely have an entire loss of crew on Apollo 10. So bucket one's just going to be death. Bucket two, we're going to look at is going to be an Apollo 13 style accident. Like pretty much Apollo 10 is just goes down exactly like Apollo 13. What happens? So let's take a look at death. No more peanuts. Charles Schulz understood and was even asked this. What happens if something goes horribly wrong on Apollo 10? He's like, well, if they're willing to risk their lives, I should be willing to risk my cartoon strip. He understood that if some tragedy befell the mission, that it would be the end of his cartoon strip, because Charlie Brown and Snoopy and the others would be forever tainted by this tragedy. But he was willing to take the risk. So if that had happened, probably no more Peanuts, no more Charlie Brown, no more Snoopy. So in that scenario, you have two possibilities, right? You have the lunar crash, which would have just killed Cernan and Stafford. John Young, who would have been in the command module, he would have had to have flown home alone by himself, but he would have lived, and the accident would have been caused by human error. And there's a difference between death as the result of human error versus the death because the machine failed. As to how much of a difference, well, probably in terms of the end result, probably not much. The only thing that would probably make a difference on is, when do you do Apollo 11? Like, when would you try to land on the moon? If was simply they crashed in the moon due to human error, there's probably a very good chance that Apollo 11 still launches in 1969. They might even try to still launch in July, just kind of as a way of trying to move past the tragedy quickly. There probably would have been others, some would have argued that. Probably some others would have argued, like, let's give a little time here, like some respect for the dead, okay? They instead then might have pushed Apollo 11 to Apollo 12's launch window in November. Either way, they're still going to make an attempt in 1969 to launch, because in their eyes, there's actually nothing wrong with the vehicle itself. They still would have tried it. And they would have been under pressure for a couple of different reasons. I mean, one, there was the personal pressure they would have been under to, meet the dream, the goal, right? Kennedy, get a man to the moon before the end of the decade and return him safely to the Earth. That, a lot of people internalize that as a very personal thing. Then you had Richard Nixon, the new president of the United States. He was very foreign policy focused and very determined to reap the benefits and rewards of the Apollo lunar landing. Certainly not interested in having to own any accidents or misfortune, or he didn't want to take responsibility for anything going wrong. He just wanted the gravy, and he was going to leverage that for his foreign policy objectives. His administration spent millions of dollars, I mean, like tens of millions of dollars in 1969 dollars, to build new television stations across the world, new radio towers across the world, even to set up airplane newspaper delivery service, so that pretty much everyone on the planet, if you didn't have access to a television or a radio, don't worry, you're gonna get Apollo moon landing coverage. We're gonna hook you up. He wanted biggest bang for the buck on that one, so he would have put tremendous political pressure on NASA to get it done, get this tragedy out of the news headlines, and let's capitalize on this moment. Had it been a failure of the spacecraft itself, where it resulted in the total loss of crew, I don't know about you. I mean, you can comment below, but I don't even see another lunar mission happening in 1969. In our timeline, it was like over a year before we did like another launch after the Apollo 13 accident happened. I certainly think they would try very hard to get it going again, but likely Apollo 11 is delayed until 1970. They probably would try to get things going in time for maybe April of 1970, which was Apollo 13's launch window. Depending on the political pressure and the desire to meet Kennedy's dream, maybe they might have taken the chance of doing the best minimum fix they could to the service module and attempt another launch in 1969 in the hopes of being able to land on the moon and do that before the end of the decade. I mean, there certainly wouldn't have been no shortage of pressure to do that. I don't know, from a safety perspective, they would have been okay with that. Well, they might have tried. And I doubt it. Ultimately, in any scenario that results in the death of the astronauts, I genuinely believe Apollo 15 would have been the last lunar mission, period. In our timeline, Nixon originally actually contemplated this and was talked out of it. He was actually talked out of canceling Apollo and just leaving it up to NASA, like leaving the decision with NASA. And NASA ultimately decided to cancel things after Apollo 17, but it was NASA's call, not Nixon's. He was talked out of it. But in a scenario where people had actually died, I don't see him being talked out of it. Don't see it. I see him being like, kill that moon program. Thank you very much. And of course, in the scenario of where if they had crashed, that means that that oxygen tank still gets put into Apollo 13. So then you would be in a world where Apollo 10 crashed, killed 2 astronauts, and then a couple missions later, an oxygen tank explodes. In terms of, all right, fine, we do Apollos 14 and 15 to kind of like save face, but at that point, like people's confidence in the spacecraft would be pretty low. Now the other scenario would be, yes, an Apollo 13 style scenario, but it goes down exactly how it did in our timeline. Like they're on their way to the moon, and it explodes, and they use the LEM as a lifeboat, and everyone gets home safe. Yay! And the least end result would be Jim Lovell gets to walk on the moon in Apollo 13. That would be exciting. The other thing is I still think they would have attempted a lunar landing in 1969. It would have been really dangerous, but I think they still would have tried it. Even though the vehicle had failed, because they had gotten the astronauts back alive, I think I mean, obviously they wouldn't have gotten the very important radar data. But I don't think that would have stopped them. Let me know if you disagree with me on this one. But I think what they would have tried to do is do the minimum number of fixes they could do to mitigate the risk, and then give Apollo 11 all the fuel they needed. Give it your best shot. We'll let you try to land. We'll let you try. Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong being who they were, I'd say there's a pretty good chance that they probably would have actually pulled it off. And given the fact that the computer kept locking up and the radar kept losing stuff, the Neil Armstrong practically landed that thing manually anyway. I'd say there was probably a better than fair chance that they could have pulled it off without a successful Apollo 10 mission. They certainly would have. I think NASA and everyone would have let them try. Obviously, I think that means there would have been the mission Apollo 11 would have been pushed back to November of '69. Obviously, would have been a higher risk, but again, I think between the personal pressure of achieving Kennedy's dream and the political pressure from Nixon, I think they would have given it a shot, and they probably would have been successful. It also means, though, that all the other Apollo missions get pushed back, right? Like Apollo 12 now gets pushed back to Apollo 13's launch window, April of '70, and everyone just gets pushed back one. Originally in 1970, they had planned 3 lunar landings. Apollo's, in our original timeline, they were originally going to land 13, 14, and 15 in 1970. Like all 3 of those were going to land. And then because of the Apollo 13 accident, a lot of that stuff got canceled, scrubbed, reorganized, and we never actually had a time where we did 3 lunar landings in here. That never happened. Whereas in this case, yeah, you could have Apollo 12 land in April of 1970, Apollo 13 in July of '70, and Apollo 14 in December of '70. This would have been really different. Because after 1970, NASA decided they were only going to do 2 lunar launches or 2 Saturn V launches a year due to budget restrictions. Because of that, okay, that meant 1971 you would have had Apollos 15 and 16. 72, you would have had 17 and 18. I think the odds of had an Apollo 13 style accident, happened to Apollo 10, basically just changed the 3 to a 0. I think your chances of having at least up to Apollo 18 are probably really, really, really good. And our timeline, we only went up to Apollo 17, which was in December of '72. That could have been Apollo 18 in this scenario, because the major reason for NASA choosing to cancel any further moon landing programs didn't really have to deal with money. I mean, money was a factor, and particularly as space shuttle development got further along, that became a bigger piece. The single largest contributing factor was NASA management no longer had faith in the vehicle. Certainly their confidence in the vehicle was nowhere near what the astronauts' confidence in the vehicle was. You remember, Apollo 11 put our confidence and everything like way up here, like right, we're riding this high wave of confidence, and like, yeah, we landed on the moon, and then Apollo 13 happens. It's like pops the balloon, and we're just like, right, like, oh, okay. I mean, Apollo 14, okay, cool, we can do this, we get back. Apollo 15 is like awesome, but our confidence and everything only gets back up to here, right? It can never get back up to that place. You can never get back to the confidence and the high that you had after Apollo. You never get that after Apollo 13. Whereas if that had happened with Apollo 10, so you had this successful failure, and then any issues of confidence get wiped out immediately with an actual successful lunar landing. Now, whether or not they would have been willing to take the safety risks of trying to just do some minor mods to Apollo 11 and then still attempt a landing anyway without the radar data and all this other stuff, you could debate that one. Certainly, I could see a scenario where maybe they launch Apollo 11 late 1969 to do the dress rehearsal, and Apollo 12 becomes the first landing. That would have been interesting. But either way, I still think they would have tried it. I still think they would have told Neil and Buzz to give it a shot. So you would have had at least one extra lunar landing because Apollo 13 would have been successful, but I really think there would have been an Apollo 18. So we could have had 2 extra lunar landings. But there's a lot of different ways this could have gone. Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And yeah, let me know your thoughts. I'd be curious. I'll reply to most of them or all of them. Kind of get a little discussion going on, see what you think. If I should do more of these, but if there's a specific mission or event you'd like me to tackle next, feel free to let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And yeah, special thanks to Everyday Astronaut for, please check out his channel for making his music available, which I use in my intro. Again, I'm Zach Smith, Reminiscing Rocketeer. Catch you on the flip side.